The rain had been falling for hours, turning the city into a blur of trembling lights and shivering shadows, but nothing looked as broken as the girl standing beneath the flickering street lamp. Her clothes were soaked through, her hair clung to her face, and her eyes, tired, hollow, yet strangely hopeful, seemed to scream for help even when her voice barely rose above a whisper. When she finally gathered the courage to speak, her words trembled like a paper about to tear. She had nowhere to sleep, nowhere to go, nowhere to exist safely for even a single night. And in that moment, something inside the young man who found her shifted forever. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but out of a quiet, instinctive kindness that felt as natural as breathing. That night became the moment their worlds collided in a way that would change both of them in ways neither expected. If you believe in kindness, humanity, and second chances, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps the stories reach more hearts. The girl's name was Amina, and she had been wandering the streets for nearly 3 days, trying to outrun circumstances that had grown too heavy for her small frame to carry. Life had always been difficult, but recently it had become unbearable, and after losing her job, her tiny shared room, and the last person she thought she could rely on, she found herself standing alone in a world that didn't seem to pause for anyone's pain. She had tried to tell herself it would get better, that she'd find something, some corner, some chance, but everything kept slipping just out of reach, leaving her struggling against exhaustion and fear. She had always been resilient, yet even resilience breaks when it goes too long without rest. On the other end of that rainy street was Harris, a quiet, hard-working young man who seldom stepped outside his structured, predictable routine. He was the kind of person who kept his head down, did what was right, and walked with calm purpose. But when he saw Amina shivering beneath the dim streetlight, something urged him, softly but firmly, to stop and look again. There was an indescribable fragility about her, as though she was moments from collapsing into the cold pavement. He approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her, but also unable to walk away. He had seen struggling people before, who hadn't these days, but something about her eyes made it impossible to pretend she wasn't there. Amina wasn't used to asking for help, and every instinct inside her told her to keep silent, to hide her weakness, to carry her burdens quietly as she had always done. But exhaustion broke down her walls, and before she knew it, the words slipped out. She didn't have anywhere to sleep. Her voice cracked when she said it, as if the words themselves hurt. She didn't ask for money or food or miracles, just a place to close her eyes without fear. That simplicity struck Harris in a way he didn't expect. He didn't know her story yet. He didn't even know her name. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. She should not be outside in a night like this. He led her gently to his small apartment several streets away, never touching her, never rushing her, just walking beside her with a quiet presence that felt safer than she expected. When they reached the warmth of his home, Amina's trembling grew worse, the contrast between the bitter rain and unexpected shelter overwhelming her senses. The apartment was modest, with only the essentials, but to her it felt like stepping into another world, one where she wasn't invisible. Hadis made her a warm drink and told her she could take the bed. It wasn't an offer filled with theatrics or forced generosity, but a simple, honest gesture that came from the heart. Amina tried to refuse, insisting she couldn't take his only comfortable space, but he was firm in the gentlest way possible. She needed rest more than he did. After a long, shaky moment, she finally allowed herself to lie down, while he quietly spread a blanket on the floor and switched off the light. Amina fell asleep within minutes, and for the first time in weeks, her body fully relaxed. She didn't know that Hadis remained awake for a long while, staring at the ceiling, processing the weight of what had happened. He wasn't afraid of her, nor did he regret his decision. He simply felt a strange protectiveness stir inside him,
a quiet understanding that someone lost had stumbled into his life for a reason he didn't yet know. His mind drifted to thoughts of what her story might be, what pain she had endured, what fears chased her through the night until she ended up here. He didn't realize when exhaustion finally crept up on him and he drifted off on the hard floor. But when morning arrived, the ache in his back was accompanied by a gentle peace he hadn't felt in years. Amina woke slowly, confused at first. The room was unfamiliar, yet soft sunlight filtered through the curtains, bathing everything in a warm glow she hadn't experienced in so long. She looked to the floor and saw him, curled up with a thin blanket, asleep in the most uncomfortable position. Something twisted inside her chest when she realized he had genuinely given up his bed for her. Nobody had ever done something like that before. She had grown up in a world where people barely had enough for themselves, let alone enough to share. She watched him for a moment, not in admiration or romantic wonder, but in a deep, aching disbelief that kindness like this still existed. She thought about slipping out quietly, disappearing before she became a burden, but her body felt too weak and her heart too cracked to run again. When Haris eventually woke, he found her sitting at his small dining table, hands folded tightly, eyes lowering like a child expecting scolding. But he smiled softly, asked if she slept well, and suddenly the floodgates opened. Not all at once, not in a dramatic collapse, but piece by piece, like someone gently opening a long locked door. She began sharing fragments of what brought her there, not every detail, not every scar, just enough for him to understand that life had pushed her beyond her breaking point. He didn't interrupt or question unnecessarily. He simply listened, offering quiet reassurance through his presence alone. Over the next few days, something subtle but powerful unfolded between them. Haris continued sleeping on the floor, no matter how much she insisted he take the bed back. Amina found herself slowly regaining strength, physically and emotionally. She helped around the apartment, cleaned, cooked simple meals, and tried to make herself as small a burden as possible. But the more she tried to disappear, the more Haris brought her back into the light. He encouraged her to rest. He reminded her she wasn't in anyone's way. He talked to her about life, about resilience, about starting again. He wasn't trying to play hero, he was simply being human, and that simple humanity felt like a lifeline. Amina eventually began searching for work again, and though the process was rough, filled with rejections and discouraging moments, she no longer faced them alone. Every evening she returned to the small apartment, to the man who never once made her feel unwanted or judged. She began feeling a strange warmth around him, not romantic or expected, but comforting, like a steady anchor after drifting too long in rough waters. He gave her space, allowed her to heal without pressure, and made room for silence when silence was needed. In return, she found small ways to bring light into his life, cooking dishes he hadn't tasted since childhood, organizing his cluttered shelf, quietly fixing things he didn't even know were broken.
Weeks passed, and Amina found a part-time job in a local bakery. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't solve everything, but it gave her a sense of purpose she had been yearning for. The beautiful smell of bread and warm pastries became her morning companion, and the stable routine gave her days structure again. She returned home every evening with stories of customers, co-workers, small triumphs, and small frustrations. Harris listened with that same quiet attentiveness, and she realized she hadn't had someone genuinely listen to her in years. As Amina healed, she noticed something new forming inside her. Gratitude, yes, but something deeper too. A quiet courage, a desire to rebuild, a belief that maybe she deserved a place in the world after all. And though she had walked into Harris's life soaked, trembling, and nearly broken, she now felt like someone capable of standing again. But healing wasn't linear.
One night, after a particularly difficult day at work, memories of her past rushed back like a storm, overwhelming her until she could barely breathe. She sat on the edge of the bed, shaking, unable to stop the tears. Harris entered the room and froze, not out of confusion, but out of fear of making things worse. He stepped closer slowly, knelt beside her, and reminded her that pain doesn't define a person, that she wasn't alone anymore, that one night of slipping backward didn't erase all the steps she had taken forward. His words were gentle but strong, steady but soft, and for the first time in a long time, she felt safe enough to cry openly, without shame. That night became another turning point, not because something romantic happened, but because Amina realized that healing often begins with having one person who makes you feel seen. And Harris realized that strength sometimes looks like being the person someone trusts enough to cry in front of. Slowly, life began to settle into a beautiful, quiet rhythm, one filled with hard work, shared laughter, occasional stumbles, and small victories. Harris finally allowed himself to take the bed again, only after Amina insisted firmly, and they settled into an unspoken understanding built on respect, trust, and genuine care. Their connection deepened naturally, without pressure, like a plant growing steadily toward the sun. Months later, Amina stood at the window of the apartment that had once been a stranger's home and was now a place filled with warmth and memories. She remembered the rain, the streetlight, and the crushing weight of having nowhere to go. She remembered whispering those painful words and thinking she was at the end of her journey. But life had surprised her in the most unexpectedly gentle way. She didn't know if fate had led her to Harris or if it had simply been life's quiet way of giving her one last chance to be saved, but she was grateful beyond measure. As she prepared dinner that evening, her hands no longer shook the way they once did. Her heart no longer carried that unbearable, lonely heaviness. She had survived, healed, and grown, and she wasn't alone anymore. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and share the video. Your engagement truly helps us continue creating meaningful stories for you. Before the ending, please comment below. Kindness changes everything. Amina and Harris weren't extraordinary people, nor were their lives dramatically different from countless others struggling quietly in the world. But sometimes all it takes is one moment of unexpected kindness to shift the trajectory of someone's life. One bed given in compassion, one night of shelter, one act of humanity. And from that single moment, a future can grow, steady, hopeful, and beautifully alive. And that was the quiet miracle of the night she whispered she had nowhere to sleep, and he gave her his bed and slept on the floor.